Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. This week, I challenged myself to paint my very first Space Marine, but not just any old Space Marine. I chose Lieutenant Titus himself. In the few years since I started painting miniatures again, I have yet to paint a single Space Marine. I have painted Chaos Space Marines, which is pretty close, but this is the first loyalist Space Marine I've ever painted. I've chosen to keep him accurate to how he appears in the game, so I'm challenging myself to paint him as neatly as possible, just like the box art. So that means I'm focusing on neat shadows and highlights, which is why this week I've skipped the base coating stage. I'm also not going to talk that much about the paints I'm using. The recipe for a standard ultramarine is everywhere on the internet, and I'll link down in the description below the website that I'm using. It's called Heavy Archive and it's fantastic. The main question I have is how close can I get to box art quality? And I'll be sharing the techniques along the way that help me get the best paint job possible. For precise work like this, I knew I was going to need a fresh, brand new brush, so I pulled out an Artist Opus Series S that has a really good point. On my wet palette here, I wanted to show what a mix of 1-to-1 Cantor blue and black look like. Unless you're using specific measurements, then mixing blobs of paint with a paintbrush isn't an exact science. The important thing is to go for a paint that is a visual step darker and more desaturated, so that you can actually notice the difference when you put it in the shadows. And if you wanted to, you could even go darker with your mix here and make more contrast on your model by having darker shadows. Next, I wanted to show how I'm stabilizing my hands. I'm using one hand firmly planted on the desk, and then I'm using the other hand resting on the bridge of my thumb to help make it as stable as possible. And you may have heard it before, but drawing your brush downwards in a straight line towards you really does help you get a better line. That's something I definitely confirmed while doing this video. So then I started to begin to add my shadows. And at first I'm going to share my footage at a fairly close to normal speed, but then I'll be speeding up as I go so that you don't have to watch me put in every single line. But the main thing for this part was to take my time, to be as neat as possible, but not to worry too much because you can always clear this up with the base coat if you make a mistake. This step will look quite subtle with only the base coats, but when we bring the lighter highlights in later, we'll definitely notice the contrast more. And so I just kept working around the model, going through all the recesses across all of the armor and adding in a bit of that darker blue. On my other miniatures, I've had a tendency to paint all downward facing areas in shadow, and for this miniature I made sure to specifically not do that. I just painted the panel line recesses, and that was it. I didn't forget to show some attention to the sub-assemblies, so I made sure that I went to the shoulder pads and the backpack, and I added in my shadow lines there as well. And with all the shadows on the miniature, it looked like this. It's quite subtle, but that will change as I add highlights, so I trusted the process and continued. I also had to add shadows for all the non-blue parts of the miniature, so you can see me using Reichland Flesh Shade here to add in some shadows to the gold. And I didn't add this wash all over, I kind of tactically added it to just the areas I knew I wanted shadow. And then I did the same thing to the silvery metals. And then I have to admit that I made a bit of a silly error. When following the recipe, instead of painting the leather parts Doombull brown, I just painted them Rhinox hide. I don't know why I did that. So I had to come back in and add the Doombull brown. So for this stage I'm actually doing the opposite and adding a slightly lighter colour, so almost like a highlight to the darker recesses that are supposed to be Rhinox hide. So I did that, and then I covered the eyes with a bit of Mephiston red. I made a bit of an error around the eye, which I just used a bit of water to try and clean off the most of, and then came back in with some blue and neatened that up after. So that's all the shadows applied, and now we move on to the wet palette again, and we're showing a mix of standard Mechanicus grey and black. Same thing again, it needs to be distinctly darker. But this time it's not a shadow, we're going to use it as our first highlight on top of all the black parts of the model. The weird thing about some of these small parts, like these black parts, are that the details are so small you can barely do various levels of highlights. To do a chunky highlight and a thinner highlight is ridiculous on some of these tiny little ridges, so I focused just on catching raised edges with the brush. However, the gun and the sword are a bit bigger, so you can do a chunky highlight on those. Something I did at the end of pretty much every stage of highlighting on every part of the model was to come back in with some of the base coat and just clean up my lines. I knew I wanted super clean, straight edged lines, so that's what I was trying to achieve here, going back in with the black base coat and trying to make the lines thinner and neater. Then it was time for another highlight with Dawnstone, which I tried to keep even smaller than the previous level of highlight, which was very difficult. I found not knowing how chunky I needed to make my chunkier highlights was pretty tricky, and that was something that I think I got a little bit better at as I went on with this model. One of the things I did a lot was I used something that I'm now calling ghost strokes. If it has a proper name, let me know. But I basically take my brush and above the line where I'm actually going to draw, I do a pretend version of the stroke above it multiple times. It sort of primes and readies my brush stroke, and I gradually lower the brush until it hits just the highest point. Then to neaten up my Dawnstone layer, I use the previous mix of Mechanica Standard Grey and Black, and I use that to thin and neaten my lines of Dawnstone. So then when I've got thin lines of Dawnstone, I finally come in with Administratum Grey, which is the final highlight, and I add that over the top, and I just try and keep it as thin and on the edge as possible. So with the highlights on the black parts done, I thought the blue parts were the next outermost area. So it's back to the wet palette to show how I made a mix of Calgar blue and Macragge blue for the first highlight. For this first layer of highlight, I knew I had to go chunky. To achieve this, I drew a small highlight like I normally would, and then I just doubled the width of the line by drawing another line next to it. That would ensure that when I come in with my next layer, I know that my thin highlight will definitely sit within what I've just painted as this first highlight. With the hindsight of now having finished this paint job, I would say that you have to be careful with this, because if you go too chunky and you make your line here really thick, it will give you this weird Tron line effect on your miniature at the end, where you'll have these really chunky highlights that are really thick. And when you look at the box art, the highlights are often really quite thin. Because there's a lot of blue on the model, there was a lot of highlighting, and it took me hours and hours just to do each layer of highlight on this blue part. I took my time, I was precise, I tried not to make too many mistakes so I didn't have to do too much cleanup, and I just kept going, and I got into a bit of a flow. And I think that really helps with this, is if you just lose yourself into some music or a podcast or whatever you've got and just keep painting. I finally reached the helmet of the miniature, and I was nearly done with the first layer of highlights on the blue. Psych, I still had to do the sub-assemblies, so still had to do the backpack and the shoulders as well. So this is the progress I've made so far with the first layer of highlights on the blue. And I wasted no time getting onto the second highlight. This time it's pure Calgar blue. Because of the approach of doubling the width of my first highlight, I actually found applying this second highlight layer really easy, because I had plenty of space to add it in a nice thin line. So all I had to do was focus on being really neat and getting good paint coverage. As I got to brighter highlights throughout this paint job, the importance of the consistency of the paint was really something that I felt like I learned a lot about. There is a Goldilocks place between too watery and too thick, where highlights are really easy to run off the brush and apply, but still cover well. And if you paint like this, you will start to get an understanding of what that looks like and how that feels on the brush and on your palette. Which, aside from having a really cool miniature at the end, is another reason why painting like this is really worth doing. I was genuinely surprised that on the first try for most of these lines, I managed to get them quite neat. I think that's just because I've been painting for a few years and my brush control must be a little bit better than I thought it was. I did have to do quite a lot of cleanup as well though, so, and some of that's off camera, some of that's on camera. And then I worked my way up to the helmet once again, and that was the second layer of highlights done, which means there's only one to go. And of course, I also did that on the shoulders and the back, and I was really glad that I left these off because it really helped me access the miniature. But before doing the final highlight of blue, I wanted to go to the bags and satchels around his waist and do some of the highlighting and shading there. The long pouch on Space Marine box art often has these two diagonal lines of shadow and highlight that run down them. It's to create a bit of interest on an otherwise flat surface. The problem is they look like they're glazed and mixed and blended really nicely, which makes it really difficult to follow that exactly. So what I ended up doing was adding Rhinox hide to the areas that I could see weren't catching the light, and then I added that, and then I ended up adding Doomball Brown over the top of it as a glaze to just try and lighten it a little bit and make it not seem quite as dark and as contrasty. Because it's such a subtle dip in the material, you don't want it to be a really stark contrast. And then, as per the recipe, I used a chunky highlight of Scrag Brown to go around all the bags and pouches. The final highlight of the belt area was done with Towelite Ochre, and same thing as I did on the blue, just trying to make a thinner line that fits within the scrag brown I've just applied. With the pouches completed, I moved back to the blue armour and I did my final highlight, which is pure Fenrisian grey. Because there are already 2 highlights on this part of the model, I had to be really careful that this third line of highlight that I was adding was really thin and didn't cover all of the previous layer of highlight. So I was really careful and I kept checking my work to see how I was doing. And little by little, I worked on each part of the miniature to try and get the thinnest lines possible. In order to get the smallest highlight possible, I needed to make sure that I had the perfect angle for the brush, so rotating the miniature to match that perfect angle was especially important for this final highlight. For some areas where it's difficult to turn the miniature upside down and reach them, I did have to practice doing my highlights without that edge technique and just trying to brush them on as carefully as I could, and I'm demonstrating that here on the belly flaps. At this point, I was really glad I had the shoulders separate from the miniature because it made it way easier to draw a thin line for this final highlight. I could draw the brush towards me really nice and neatly. And with that final layer of highlights done, this is what the armour was looking like. I managed to keep my lines really neat, but there's something about the model at this point that was looking a bit weird. And in my mind, I think it was that Tron lines thing I was talking about earlier. I think some of my highlights here, maybe my second layer or my third layer, or even my final layer, were just a little bit too thick. So I had to fix this, so I spent a little bit of time working with my 3 highlight layers to thin each highlight line so that it was only about 1 millimeter thick, or less. And this is where I think the brush control really comes into this kind of painting. Maybe with a smaller tipped brush or a steadier hand, I could have achieved this the first time round. But at my level, I still had to do a lot of neatening up. And this is the comparison between the 2 shoulders after I'd done the first shoulder's neatening. So you can see the thicker blue line of Fenrisian on the shoulder with all the parchment, and the thinner line on the other shoulder after I'd neatened it up. So the next thing to do was to do that over the whole model and take any of the lines that I thought looked a bit thick and to just thin them. So that's what all these clips will show me doing now. I think this is probably why often on most of the box art, 2 levels of highlight are the only thing that's actually visible. I think just practically having the 3 levels of highlight is really tricky. But I did all 3 as you saw, and I've tried to make it as neat as possible, and I'm hoping that some of the colours retain in those areas so that you get that 3-way transition to a brighter colour. To highlight the cloth piece under the belt, I used Celestra Grey as my base coat, and then I worked up to a pure white. Because the recipe that I was following didn't have exactly this kind of cloth material, it did have some white armour guides, so I used similar paints to that. To try and keep the highlighting style, I used a really bright white to just paint a line down the middle of the top of the ridges. This would guarantee that I had a bright highlight down that line, and then I would use slightly darker colours just on either side of it to create that transition to shadow and highlight. The small details were really fun to paint on this miniature, so I did the parchment and the helmet, and I also did the wax seals for all the parchment as well. And just because you've got to, I had to go at freehanding some of the writing on the parchment. I used Rhinox Hide and Black for this, and I just drew little squiggly lines all the way across them. I also decided for some crazy reason that I was going to freehand the word ultra onto the other part of parchment above, and so I've cut out that whole process because it was pain, but I eventually got a set of letters that I was happy with. I would definitely say plan out the spacing of your letters first. That definitely helped me get the final result. I ended up glazing over the writing with Screaming Skull, which is the highlight for this parchment, just because I wanted to tone down the darkness of the writing. Even though I'd used the recipe scheme, it just seemed a bit too dark for me and it stood out too much. I then cheated a bit and I highlighted the skull with the same colours as the parchment, but I went a little bit brighter with a pure white as well. I didn't own the colours that were in the recipe for the wax seals, so I used Emperor's Children to mix into the Screamer Pink base coat and to create highlight colours. Then I highlighted all of the red going all the way up to Wild Rider Red. For the lenses in the helmet, I did basically the same recipe as the red, but instead of going up to Wild Rider Red, I went one step further to Fire Dragon Bright. I held my breath to dot the eyes with a tiny dot of white at the back, and fortunately I got very lucky and I did it right first time. Now it was time to do the metals on the miniature. And this stage was more of the same highlighting and very similar and straightforward. I just used a mix of Retributor Armor and Stormhost Silver to do my first layer, and then pure Stormhost Silver for my second layer. The silvery metals were again similar to that. They used a mix of Lead Belcher and Stormhost Silver for the first highlight, and then pure Stormhost Silver for the second highlight. One thing missing from the recipe that I definitely wanted to show was this yellow line at the bottom of his white cloth below his belt. I had no idea what paints to use, and I don't own any Games Workshop yellow paints, so I turned to using the non-metallic metal gold set from AK Interactive that I've used in previous videos. Because this looked like a gold, I thought why not use gold? And so I used Sahara Yellow as a base coat, and then I worked up to Ice Yellow with mixes, and I just highlighted the highest bits and kept the lowest bits dark. In the recipe, and something that's definitely on the box art, are these darker areas on the feet and legs. This is achieved with a mix of Rhinox Hide and Macragge Blue, so it's just a base coat with a bit of brown mixed into it. And I painted this on just those lower areas, make them look weathered and more dirty. Then I painted his tactical rock, and I did that as per the instructions for any kind of normal rock. So I did Dawnstone, and then I shaded it with Agrax Earthshade, and then I did a highlight of Administratum Grey. He has a little skull on his base as well, and I did the same thing I did with the skull on the shoulder pad. So I just used the parchment colours of a Shabty Bone and Screaming Skull, and then a little bit of white to finish up. And then finally, after a whole week of painting this guy, he was finished. I did also paint his base, and I'll include that in a short on the channel, but you will also see it here in the final reveal. But now, here's the finished miniature. So the question is, did I do it? Does this look like the box art? Let me know down below. I think even if it's not 100% there, it's pretty close. So I'm pretty proud of this paint job, and I'm delighted to add Titus to my collection as one of my new favourite miniatures. I'm looking forward to painting way more Space Marines on the channel in all kinds of different styles and colours in the future. As always, a massive thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you'll join me for the next one. If you want to help me grow, please press all the good buttons below, and I'll get cracking on the next video.